Welcome everybody to what is the 8th lecture in our summer lecture series titled From the Rooftops. These lectures are coming to you from the Landscape Architecture Department here in the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Richard Weller, I'm the chair of the department, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Christopher Marcinkoski. Christopher is an associate professor of landscape architecture here in the department. He is also a licensed architect and the founding director of Port. Port is a leading-edge public realm and urban design consultancy whose current work includes projects in Chicago, Cleveland, Denver, Philadelphia, and Knoxville, Tennessee. Prior to his appointment at Penn, Chris was a senior associate at James Corner Field Operations, where he led that office's urban design and planning work, including the Quinhai Water City in Shenzhen, China, and Shelby Farms Park in Memphis, Tennessee. Christopher's recent book, The City That Never Was, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2016, explores the phenomenon of what he refers to as speculative urbanization. It considers the implications of urbanization activities that are wildly out of sync with economic, ecological, and demographic realities. Chris's current research, under the rubric of Africa 2040, builds on this scholarship by exploring the recent proliferation of proposals for and the construction of new town and vanity infrastructure projects throughout Africa. These sorts of projects are emulating much of the speculative building that recently occurred in the boom and bust cycles in places like Spain, Ireland, Dubai, and China. Christopher's design work and research have been widely published in academic, professional, and mainstream media platforms. His work has been recognised by the Van Allen Institute, the Powerhouse Dessau Foundation, the Graham Foundation, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill Foundation, the American Institute of Architects, the Chicago Architecture Club, and most recently, the American Academy in Rome, which awarded him the 2015 Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture. Chris holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the Pennsylvania State University and a Master of Architecture from Yale University. So please join me in welcoming Chris to the digital platform today and enjoy the lecture.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to check out this lecture. My name is Christopher Marcinkoski. I'm an associate professor of landscape architecture and urban design at the Weitzman School, trained as an architect and a principal of Port, a urban design practice based in Philadelphia and Chicago. What I want to try to talk to you guys about today here, if I can attempt to share my screen, is a phenomenon that I refer to as speculative urbanization. And this is something that I think will be of interest to those of you coming into the program or considering the program, as it tries to mount a bit of an argument for the utility of landscape as a principal driver or organizer of urban settlement or future urban settlement. So the title of this lecture is Why Landscape? Urbanization in the Age of Speculation. And I will attempt over the next 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how this all goes, to sort of talk about this phenomenon or this kind of idea, body of research in three parts. The first part is sort of the origins of the research, some work that I did a few years ago related to the financial crisis of 2008, that transitions then to kind of ongoing research looking at the phenomenon as it exists today in one of the kind of epicenters of this. And then finally kind of concluding with a little bit of a kind of polemic or manifesto about the role that I think design really should play in relationship to, and design education, landscape architectural design education in particular, should play in relationship to this phenomenon. So I know this our lecture series is titled From the Rooftops. I'm not on a rooftop, I'm in my home office, but here's a picture of some rooftops in Morocco outside of Tangier, or sorry, outside of Marrakesh. This may be the only rooftop portion of the lecture. But in any case, what I want to talk about with you today is this idea of speculative urbanization. And this is a phenomenon that, for me, refers to the construction of new settlement and infrastructure that's driven by political and economic purposes. This as opposed to meet real or projected demographic or market demand. The idea here is pretty simple. It can not only include physical building, but also the legislative redesignation and reparcelization of land. Drawing a plan has the effect of changing the value of a piece of property or a piece of land. So it's not only the construction of urbanization, but it's the projection or the proposition of urbanization that I'm thinking about. The work that I'm going to show you today refers primarily to activities occurring at the periphery of existing settlements or an entirely ex-urban context greenfield sites. So yes, there is speculative activities on within existing settlement in the cores of existing cities, but that's not the focus of the research that I'm going to share with you. So the thing about this work, and I think what's notable about it, is in fact the scale. And so these projects and these examples that I want to show you today are really at the scale of an urban district or a territory. They're large, 300 hectares or more, many of them thousands of hectares in area. So this idea of speculation is not sort of spec office space or a spec housing. This is really speculative settlement at that kind of large territorial scale. So for most people, when we hear the word speculation or speculative building, our sort of the mind immediately goes to housing, and it really goes to the financial crisis of 2008. And so we've all sort of seen and heard and maybe even lived through the kind of the bubble of 2008, the housing bubble here in the United States that was sort of present throughout the Sun Belt and really throughout the country in varying degrees. But this phenomenon during that period of time was exceptional because it didn't take place just within one country. It was actually spread worldwide. And so you found examples of this in Ireland with the Irish ghost estates. You sort of saw this within the Middle East, places like Dubai and other areas of the Emirates that were building in a way that was really anticipating a certain population, anticipating a certain market, wasn't really driven by the reality of those markets. So this idea of housing being the kind of principal driver of speculation is one that gets kind of reinforced in mainstream media, whether that's in sort of newspaper articles or whether that's in movies like The Big Short, which really focused on the kind of financial instruments associated with what it means to build housing in the United States. And so while this is an example of speculative urbanization, the examples I'm going to show you are actually much broader and much greater than even these housing booms and busts are indicative of. So for me, the reason that this is important and is something that is worth thinking about as a designer or as an urban planner is that it has more than just economic impact. It has sort of socio-political impact. It has environmental impact in terms of the construction of this settlement on greenfield sites or on new territories. And then obviously it has the financial disruptions that we saw a decade or so ago during the financial crisis. And so it's this sort of multiplicitous sort of manifestation of the phenomenon that I think makes it something that we as designers, urban designers and urban planners really need to pay attention to and focus on. And to be honest, there's not a great deal of literature from our disciplines about this subject matter. There's a great deal elsewhere, but design and planning, in essence, don't really want to bite the hand that feeds it, and so we don't talk about it very much as a kind of concern. So what brought me to this subject matter as a kind of broader study was actually an initial project that was looking at an example of the speculative urbanization in Spain and what took place on the Iberian Peninsula over a kind of 10-year period from 1998 through 2008, 2009. And what's really fascinating about this, and this is the shameless plug, this is the subject matter of a book that was published by Princeton Architectural Press. But what was compelling about this for me is that you had an example of a kind of Western democratic economy that was using urbanization in a way that was comparable to how we understand developing economies to use it, and was using that urbanization as a way to radically transform both its economy and its society. So you don't need to read all of the text on the screen. I'm certainly not going to read all of it. But what it points out is that over this decade-long period, the amount and the rate of urbanization ongoing in Spain was astronomical. So the official number was that 15% of the country's GDP was devoted to construction. Other estimates suggest that that was more like 20%. GDP more than doubled over that period of time. 7 million homes were constructed, not to mention all of the ones that were planned that were not completed because of the bubble. And what was amazing about Spain is that it wasn't just housing. It was airports, toll roads, metro lines, other infrastructures, cultural venues that were all part of this building boom and ultimate bust. And really what this was indicative of was the use of urbanization as a means of elevating Spain's role in the global economy. So you see it sort of shifted from the 34th most populous country in the world, 34th most populous country in the world, becoming the 9th largest economy. So the kind of incongruity between population and economic scale. All that to say is that basically, if you look at Spain today, roughly 1/3 of all of the land in the country that's characterized as urbanized was created during that decade. That's a really astronomical figure when you think about the long history of urban form and the history of cities within Spain. I mean, the grid, the Cartesian grid, in many ways as an urbanistic device had its origins within Spanish urban settlement as a kind of sort of colonizing device. So, this scale of transformation is really quite dramatic. And as I said, in Spain's case, it wasn't just about housing, but it was actually about this relationship between housing, the construction of housing and policy related housing, but also policy related to land and its development, as well as investment in infrastructure. And so it's this kind of mix of ingredients that I think it's important for us as designers to pay attention to, that when we're asked to sort of plan a piece of settlement like this one in Cesena that you see on the screen, more goes into it than just the ingredients of the program that's proposed as part of that project. So in Spain, land policy and the use of land has long been a political football, really since the time just after Franco took control. And really, the short story of this is that as each political power political party came into power, you would get, or a different sort of leadership would come into governance, you would get radically different approaches to land policy. And you would either sort of open it up to development or close it down, open up, close it down. What occurred in the late 1990s was actually that every political party, whether they were leftist, rightist, communist, Marxist, conservative, neoliberal, all started to see urbanization as a potential driver of growth. And so a land law that was passed at the national level and then was rescinded because it was seen as unconstitutional began to manifest itself across municipalities and across other layers of government, levels of government below the federal level in Spain. So what that land policy said is that basically almost all land that wasn't historically or ecologically designated as critical could be opened up to development. When you companion that with a housing stock that was really pretty deficient as a result of the Franco period, even as late as the 1990s, there started to be this huge demand to build new settlement. So you had land being opened up, you had demand for housing because of sort of deficient status and quality of what was available. And then the third ingredient was you had massive amounts of cohesion funds coming in from the European Union. And these were funds that were designated for Spain as a way to elevate its economy as part of the EU compact, so that it was on a level that was equal to other member states. And so these cohesion funds and these sort of EU subsidies, as a way of designating their impact and their value, often were plugged into infrastructure projects. So during this period of time, Spain received more infrastructure, more cohesion funds than any other country in the EU, and those funds went directly into infrastructure like the construction of highways, the construction of high-speed rail, airports, other urban infrastructures. The result of those three things was a radical building boom on the Iberian Peninsula. This sort of undertaking of construction was documented and exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2005 and 2006, when Terry Riley, the curator of the show, sort of declared that Spain hadn't seen this level of building in its territory since the time of the Roman occupation. And so probably correct in terms of that scale. The issue was, of course, that building boom was not evaluated in a critical form, was allowed to sort of run rampant and ultimately result in the catastrophic financial and social crisis that we saw following the 2008 financial crisis. So what's fascinating about this is really that this wasn't just sort of isolated to one city, but you saw this kind of expansion of urbanized land across the country, from major metropolitan areas like Barcelona, Madrid, down to tiny little towns that were, a few hundred people for hundreds of years, now deciding suddenly that they need to build housing for an influx of population that may or may not actually show up. The focus of my work was really on Madrid and the Madrid region around the capital. And this drawing basically shows the magnitude of what was undertaken. On the left, you see an aerial photograph. On the right, you see a diagram. At the center of that diagram, if you're able to see my mouse, was the historic core of the city of Madrid. Around that is the expansion that was proposed and undertaken during the 19th century. So you see the relative scale between those two things. And then what you see in pink is the expansion that was proposed during the first part of the 21st century. So the scale of transformation, the amount of territory that was undertaken was multiplied many times by what had previously been seen as the expansion of the city. And what you see is, particularly in the southeast, which is sort of the bottom here, building on lands that were often thought of as being too hot, too arid, too unproductive to sustain human life. This is places where the landfill and where the water treatment facility and all of the kind of dirty infrastructures of the city were pushed, that this became also a place to expand the city because there was a desire for urban growth. The result was landscapes like these, a sort of arid plateau crisscrossed by massively overscaled infrastructures that was infilled by the grids of new settlement. And this new settlement, in many cases was built out in a way that the politicians were able to claim that it was complete. But as you can see in these photographs, there's a great deal of vacancy that is available inside of those parcels. And so when you get on the ground, this is the kind of urbanism that produces. It looks good from a kind of planning document and maybe an urban design plan or drawing, but the scale of it at the ground is one that is not particularly habitable or hospitable. And so what you see here are these examples of settlements that were basically paused or abandoned altogether as a result of the financial crisis. That there was so much building going on in the capital that there was never going to be a population that was going to be able to occupy it. An interesting anecdote in this regard is that much of the population growth that was projected for the country was assumed to be people who are moving from other former Spanish colonies back to Spain or to Spain, as well as from Eastern Europe as laborers or as workers involved in the construction industries. What happened when the economy tanked is that all of those people who are anticipated to live in this new settlement, who are employed in building it, left the country and looked elsewhere for new jobs and for new opportunities. So the housing that was produced actually had no audience for its absorption. And no matter how long it might take, it was never going to be fully occupied. So some other examples of these sort of settlements from around the periphery. These are particularly in the southeast of the capital. And I think what's most telling about this is that scale of growth here that you see inside the circle at the center of the screen, which was just the capital, actually went on in comparable examples in other municipalities, large and small, surrounding it. So you had, bedroom communities or suburban communities at the periphery of Madrid that were building housing at the same rate or a similar rate as what the capital city was building. And so this lack of coordination produced this massive surplus of infrastructure and housing in and around the area. One example of that is Ciudad Valdeluz, which is a settlement that was planned for 35,000 people about 60 kilometers northeast of Madrid. That the settlement was essentially predicated on the fact that there was going to be a high-speed rail stop right about here that would whisk people living here into Madrid in under half an hour. What happened, though, was that the high-speed rail stop was never installed, or was installed but not really utilized in terms of the scheduling, and therefore there was no motivation for people to live in this new piece of settlement. So you see here, over a very short period of time, agricultural land was transformed into urban land under the kind of premise or under the hope that a piece of infrastructure would transform the value of that place. But what also ultimately resulted was an area of settlement of super low density. So you can see in comparison to the historic core of Madrid, which had a density of about 600 people per hectare, Ciudad Valdeluz was designed at 65 people per hectare, and actually its occupation is more like 5 or 6 people per hectare. So the scale comparison, both in terms of footprint, but also density, was radically incongruous from the existing urban center. So what you have, again, are landscapes like these sort of incomplete urbanizations, not only incomplete in terms of what is built and the kind of empty parcels that you see in the distance, but actually their occupation, the number of people living here. The population of Ciudad Valdeluz at present is only a few thousand, as opposed to the 35,000 that was projected for this settlement. What's really fascinating about this particular example is that the municipality that was actually in charge of overseeing Ciudad Valdeluz was a town called Yebes. Yebes had a population of a few hundred people, and decided that they could support a new settlement because of the high-speed rail connection of 35,000. And in addition to that new settlement, they were building other small areas of housing in and around the town itself. And so the number of homes, the amount of population that was projected for this place were multiple times the number of people who had lived here for centuries. And so that kind of irrationality in terms of if you build it, they will come, was enormously present here and can be found really throughout Spain during this period of time. As I mentioned before, it wasn't just housing that was constructed. You had examples of speculative infrastructure like airports, in this example outside of Ciudad Real, to the southwest of Madrid. This was a project that again was predicated on a high-speed rail connection that never came to be, and the ability to build a new airport to offset the overflow of Madrid's airport 2 hours to the north, hour and a half to the north. The irony of this project really is the fact that Madrid built its own expanded airport during the same period of time. So this privately funded endeavor, which was intended to take off some of that volume, never actually had a reason for being, because it was replaced. The old airport of Madrid was replaced before this one could ever open up. This particular example operated for 6 months, was shuttered, and has been sold a number of times. It is currently held by a Chinese entity who's looking to sort of repurpose it for some other purposes. I give these examples because of their consequence. This chart basically looks at the consolidation of banks within Spain as a result of the financial crisis, both the kind of second Spanish miracle of the early 2000s, as well as previous building booms and busts that the country experienced. What is notable about this is that many of these projects in individual municipalities and individual regions were funded by local banks. And as those local banks defaulted and as these projects defaulted, they were consolidated into a series of larger and larger national banks. And so the sort of the individual regional role of finance and of politics was undermined and sort of collapsed into this kind of much larger nationalized version of the banking system within Spain as a result of these construction enterprises. The result, as we know, both here and elsewhere, was social unrest, protesting, people in the streets, sort of, declaring that this phenomenon, this sort of use of financial instruments related to building and settlement, had catastrophic consequences that could not be repeated. That this was such a momentous burden for Spain and elsewhere throughout the world during the financial crisis of 2008, that it could never repeat because it was so severe. What's interesting about that, though, is that in the period of time that followed, the immediate period of time, 2008, 2009, 2010, there were all sorts of essays, all sorts of lectures, all sorts of symposia that talked about the need to recalibrate our relationship to urbanization as it relates to the kind of socioeconomic welfare of populations of cities. So you had, all sorts of events that were declaring, again, this can never happen in another moment in time. We must do something, must fundamentally change our mode of operating. But 5 years later, you just needed to look at any real estate page in the New York Times or on the BBC or in The Economist, and you started to see that this same kind of activity was repeating itself. That the bubble burst, and a few years later, the bubble was being inflated once again for the same reasons, to promote both economic growth and sort of project global political power. Again, going back to Spain, what's so amazing about this is that the country itself, in the major cities of the country, saw building as a way out of their building-induced crisis. So for a period of time between 2011, 2012, 2013, Madrid and Barcelona were competing for a project called Eurovegas. Eurovegas was intended to be the largest casino in Europe. It was going to be built by Sheldon Adelson and the Las Vegas Sands Corporation. And the two cities and the municipalities around them were competing to have this investment installed in their vacant areas. The irony of it was that all of the ingredients of this new casino already existed in terms of housing and hotels and cultural facilities and infrastructure, but the idea was to build more, and to build more would get them out of the financial crisis that they were in. Even more interestingly, Madrid continued to pursue things like the Olympics. And so in going after the 2020 Olympics, which were just recently rescheduled, which were awarded to Tokyo, the belief was that if the Olympics came to Madrid, the building that would be required of that enterprise would get them out of their financial crisis. Irregardless of all of the literature that says otherwise in terms of the kind of consequences of Olympics have on urban form and economies of major cities. So the irony here is that the problem, or the sort of practices that got Madrid and Spain into this problem in the first place, overbuilding, were seen as the very ingredients to get them out of that same crisis. In some ways, we shouldn't be surprised by this. If we look back over the history of speculative bubbles, there are a number of examples that we can point to that are comparable in terms of the ingredients that went into them. And so we can look at something like the Panic of 1873, which was caused by debt related to the Transcontinental Railroad being built, as a kind of infrastructural example. The Los Angeles real estate boom of a decade or so later, which was related to the opening up of new exotic territories and the funneling in of capital to try to extract value from those exotic territories, to a similar example in Florida during the 1920s that many economists say actually led to the collapse of the stock market and the Great Depression in the 1930s. In essence, as Florida's land rush ended, everybody pulled their money out of real estate and put their money into the stock market, which inflated that bubble and ultimately led to another kind of financial crash and crisis. So the thing that's really interesting about this is there are many of these examples throughout Western history of these speculative endeavors. But really what's notable is that recently that the focus of those speculative endeavors has changed. Whereas you initially had things related to land and eventually agriculture as speculative events, during the late 19th century, the focus shifted to infrastructure, whether it was canals or whether it was railroads, to the 20th century where there's a focus on the individual building, whether that was offices or housing, to really what we're beginning to see in the 21st century, which is a focus on speculative urbanization. That is the construction of wholly formed pieces of settlement with all of the previous ingredients incorporated into them: infrastructure, building, land, agriculture, all part of these large sort of speculative settlements being undertaken. What that suggests to me, and sort of what I sort of argue for as part of this research, is that for much of the world, city building, that is urbanization, has become the ultimate form of economic production. That it is an industry unto itself that is seen as being able to drive both political and economic power, or economic standing within the globe. And so these infrastructures and these settlements are no longer being undertaken as a provision of basic urban services, the way that we think of urbanization in terms of its kind of its efficacy or its sort of positive outcome, but they're actually projections of economic potential and projections of political status. We're no longer serving the populations who are in need and would be served by high quality cities. We're building things as a way of projecting an identity or a level of power that may or may not exist in a polity or in a municipality that's undertaking these kind of projects. So as I was sort of shifting or ending this work on Spain, I started looking at other examples, not just historic, but that were ongoing, contemporaneous to what was happening in Spain and during this period following the financial crisis. And you found examples of this speculative building in places like Panama, in places like Turkey, and of course in places like China, where the construction of settlement, the construction of industry, infrastructure and housing was being used to grow the economy and explicitly used to grow the economy, which has led me to look at a place where this is being sort of pursued in even more grand and more phenomenal scale. That is the African continent, which I'll get to here in a moment. In many ways, when you look at these examples, what is striking about them is usually about the point where somebody says, you know, what we're doing here is different. This isn't speculative. We have all of the, we have all of the data points and the things that will support it. When you say there's no problem here, that's usually when the problem indicator that the problem is about to arise. So this banner in Dubai is a great example. Keep calm, there is no bubble. That definitely means that there was about to be a bubble as a result of that. So when somebody says this time is different, you should go out of your way to not believe them and to really interrogate the premise of what is being proposed at that particular moment. So shifting to Africa and shifting to this new focus or sort of epicenter of research on speculative urbanization, what you have here is not dissimilar to what you have in Spain. You have a projection of population growth, in this case, much, much, much larger. By the turn of the next century, basically 40% of the population of the Earth is going to be living on the African continent. And you have that population projection in combination with cities that are characterized by both deficient infrastructure, mobility infrastructure, water infrastructure, utilities, but also deficient housing. And so as a result of that population growth and that sort of demand for settlement, a proliferation of new towns have been seen across the continent. Those new towns range in scale, they range in orientation, but there's actually something that is amazingly self-similar about them. And I'll talk about that a little bit here as I continue through the presentation. The work that I've been doing with Javier Arpa, who's a colleague from TU Delft, has been looking specifically at 120 new town projects on the African continent that are each about 300 hectares or more, typically much, much more, in the thousands of hectares, that are being proposed or being undertaken in peripheral or peri-urban sites. And so again, these are greenfield sites or areas at the edge of existing settlement where there are propositions for large-scale new pieces of settlement. And those large-scale new pieces of settlement are, as I said before, amazingly self-similar, problematically self-similar. So you see here a map that just sort of plots where the ones that we've located are. These are the ones that have press releases and sort of publicly available information in English or in French. Presumably there's a whole bunch of other ones that we are not locating here or that we haven't identified yet that are taking place elsewhere within the continent itself. So this is usually the point in my lecture where, you know, somebody sort of challenges me and says, how can you possibly look at something like the African continent in such a uniform way? It is so large, it is so diverse, it is so varied, both in terms of its culture, its landscape, its history, its politics. You can't treat it as a monolith. And you're exactly right. I mean, we can't treat, the continent has such diversity across it. The point that I make is, given that diversity, isn't it highly problematic that our proposals for settlement, or the proposals for settlement that we're seeing throughout the continent, are so self-similar, are so unconnected to the landscape that they're being deployed within, and are so generic in terms of their image and their form that they could basically be anywhere? These could be in the Middle East, they could be in China, they could be in the Western or Southern United States. There's a kind of genericism to the way that we're thinking about new cities. And the settlement that's being proposed within the African continent is subscribing to this generic ideal of the 21st century ideal city, if you will. And so these are just some of the examples of that 120. I like this one because it's called Newtown. That's basically what is being proposed here. And it's kind of got all the ingredients that I find problematic about these pieces of settlement. You have a large area of housing, you have a small central business district, you have an industrial area, an entertainment and retail zone. all of the kind of functional planning that we sort of have seen in the early modernist period that we know doesn't work, dropped into a landscape, a sort of savanna landscape that's rendered a little greener than it really actually is, with water that never flows that blue or that continuously. And so this is a kind of ideal image of the future that is completely disconnected from the reality of where it's being deployed. This wasn't always the case. In the middle 20th century, in the post-war period, settlement in Africa was seen as an equally urgent undertaking, something that needed to be thought about and considered, and was seen as a place of experimentation, and sort of new patterns, new formats of settlement that related to the place, related to the climate, related to the culture, related to the way that people were living in that particular location. These are examples from outside Casablanca. This proposal, this sort of opportunity, this demand for housing was an opportunity to innovate. And I think that's fundamentally in opposition to what we're seeing today, where there is no innovation, it's simply replication. It's sort of rubber stamping an idea of city and urban form that we are told works and that we're told has been able to be deployed elsewhere to success. So this idea of innovation, this idea of experimentation and coming up with something that is locally calibrated and unique to the place is no longer the motivation behind the kind of settlement practices that we're seeing as part of these new town programs. So if we look at this 120 or so examples of our research, there are things that are familiar about them in terms of their deficiency. They tend to be isolated geographically. They tend to be monofunctional. When they're rolled out, they're typically housing first, and then the other programs may or may not ever get built in. They're limited in their access because of their distance from existing population centers, but also because they're economically prohibitive. Many of these places are said to be for the growing middle class, but they are built in such a way and priced in such a way that the middle class can't afford what settlement is being produced. Their monofunctionality indicates an absence of culture. There's really nothing to do there other than housing. There are no public amenities, and they tend to be characterized by wildly overscaled mobility infrastructure. And by mobility infrastructure, I mean roads. I don't mean transit. If there was transit, many of these would be far more successful, but really these things are predicated on a car, access to them from the existing piece of settlement. Really, though, the thing that is characteristic of all of them and consistently across all of them is the reality of the plans privileging the outcome as opposed to the initiation. What these places will look like or should look like or might look like in 30 years, as opposed to what they look like when they're initiated or when they're deployed, and how that begins to function at the outset as opposed to how it might function 30 years in the future that no one can actually control. So when we look across these, there's a huge range of examples. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going through this, just given the amount of time that we have available, but we're able to kind of look at the 120 examples and categorize them into different types. So new national capitals, there are no fewer than 6 new national capitals being built across the African continent. This is really an example of sort of projecting an eventual political status to the world for places that are really in the process of developing and in the process of transforming economically and politically. And so, just as we had with Brasilia or Washington, D.C. or Canberra, this is really about an idea of identity and of status that is being suggested by the construction of a piece of urban form. The example that I like to point to is the new capital city of Equatorial Guinea. This is a new piece of settlement in the middle of the jungle on the mainland part of the country. The population center is actually on an island in the Atlantic. This new capital is connected by 240 kilometers of new highway, closed access highway that people can't get to, and is basically being built as a way for the long-standing dictator of the country to move the government to a place where it is no longer under threat from coup d'etat. And so the idea here is that by building a new piece of settlement in the middle of a rainforest that nobody can access, only the people in power are able to occupy and utilize this place. And so this is a project that was actually put on hold in 2018 when they discovered that they didn't know how much money they were spending. Much of this is paid for by oil dollars. But what you see here is this radically overscaled piece of settlement with nobody in it. And it had housing, it had university, it had sports stadiums, it had libraries. And the only place where you actually find people here is in the 6-star hotel, or at least that's what it's designated as, which was built for a meeting of the African Union. And so this hotel was constructed and is still operating today, but nobody stays in it. Nobody is there. It's essentially a kind of white elephant as a signifier of what this sort of undertaking as a capital city has ultimately produced. So in some cases, you know, one starts to question what the rationality of a project like this is. Other examples include sort of techno or industrial cities. These are new pieces of settlement that are motivated by trying to attract foreign investment, not in the form of private capital, but in the form of industry and in the form of institutions. So whether that's in Kenya trying to tap into the mobile phone economy, or whether that's in Morocco and trying to connect to the phosphorus and mining industry in the country, the idea here is to, again, build new settlement as a way of tapping into a new piece of economy. What's interesting here is that these are indicated or sort of presented as industrial cities or techno cities, but the bulk of what's being planned, the bulk of what's being built is housing. It's not necessarily the industry that's driving it as much as it is the provision of housing that may or may not be in demand for these particular areas. In other cases, you have new financial centers that are being proposed, you know, entirely new pieces of settlement that are related to business and banking and finance, industries that don't require physical or material, but are more transactional. Examples of this are, you know, found everywhere from Nigeria to Algeria. And so you have Echo Atlantic, which is one that is one of the more well-known ones that was initiated first as a piece of coastal defense infrastructure that then the builders behind it convinced the country to actually fill in the land and use it as a place of new settlement. And that this new settlement is at a level of luxury that is only accessible to even the wealthiest global citizen, let alone the occupant of Lagos. And so, again, the incongruity between what's being invested in and the people it's supposedly for starts to manifest itself in some of these examples, not to mention the kind of ridiculousness of the architectural form that's associated with them. The place that there is the greatest demand is this idea of middle-class housing, and we do see a great deal of that in these new town examples. But again, the problem here very much is that it's monofunctional. It's just housing. There's nothing else there. There are no jobs. There's no transport. There's no connectivity. And so it's highly undesirable as a place to live. Some of the examples in Morocco are quite telling in this way, that you have this image of Tamanzor just outside of Marrakesh, which was planned for a population of 450,000 people. To put that in perspective, Marrakesh's population today is about 900,000 people. So this was a new town 25 kilometers outside of an existing center that was intended to have half the population of that existing center, but there's nothing to do here. There are no industries, there are no jobs, there's no entertainment, there's no culture, there's simply housing. And so only a few thousand people are occupying this particular project today. And so you're left with landscapes with like these, where you have the infrastructure installed, you have the parcels plotted out, you have the utilities present, but you have no occupation. And again, this could be Spain, this could be Morocco. These are landscapes of incompletion that are sort of, we find over and over again throughout the African continent, and really throughout the sort of urbanized world. A few other pictures of Tamanzor. So you see, I mean, these are not inexpensive or cheap pieces of construction. In some cases, these are well designed, but the planning logic behind them is faulty, and therefore they'll never be occupied in the way that they were projected or proposed as part of the kind of sort of the political proposition. And what's interesting about Morocco is that there are many, many, many of these examples. And so, you know, those of you who know your geography well, Spain is just to the north here. And in many ways, Morocco has tapped into both the French legacy of new town planning, as well as what's happened more recently in Spain, to undertake this series of endeavors throughout the country of these new towns, both publicly promoted and privately promoted, that are really radically transforming the existing landscape of the country with very little regard for the character of that existing landscape. Elsewhere, you have things like social housing, subsidized housing. There are fewer of these examples, but really these are the ones that are needed most urgently in many of the countries that we've been looking at. One of the most notable examples that we found was actually in Ethiopia, where the social housing is actually being controlled and built by the state to a fair amount of success. And so these are one of the few examples of new town projects that are really, really well occupied and really, really well used. You might question the quality of what's there, but it's actually, the utility of this settlement is actually quite high. And when you start to see the scale of what's being undertaken, you realize there's actually a version of this building that's able to serve populations in a positive way, as opposed to an extractive way, like many of the other examples that I've shown here today. And so you see the scale of what's being built in a kind of a very low-tech way, but really in service of the sort of booming growth of Addis Ababa that's projected. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like tourist enclaves and entertainment enclaves. These, again, are for populations that are not in the places where these are being deployed, but are intended to be oriented to people flying in from the outside, whether that's from the kind of former colonial power, whether that's from the Middle East, or whether that's from Asia. There are lots of examples of really delirious proposals for tourist settlement and entertainment settlement throughout the continent as well, that are really just about attracting foreign capital. Luxury housing falls under this category as well. This is an example from just outside of some of that social housing that I was showing you in Addis Ababa. But a more notable example is here in South Africa, where you have Stein City. Stein City was built by a gentleman who's sort of been characterized as the Donald Trump of South Africa. This new gated community enclave is on the site of a former township in Johannesburg. That township was removed, a golf course was built, and a new piece of luxury settlement was installed, at the center of which is this Villa Stein for the promoter. And so again, the incongruity of what's being constructed here versus the population of the township that was displaced, as well as the other townships around it in Johannesburg, is striking. The last two categories, radical redevelopment. There's a handful of examples of transforming existing urban settlement. Most cases, the thought is that of the ones that we've looked at is that it's easier to build on greenfield sites than it is to modify what's already there. And there is some truth to that. It's less expensive and it's less difficult. That said, in the places where there are propositions for existing settlement, there is this really dramatic shift between what is existing and what is proposed. And the transition state is rarely talked about. The initiation, the process of transformation is not the focus. It's always the outcome that tends to be highlighted and tends to be elevated. The final example is what we call greenfield megacities. And these are really just sort of astronomical in their scale. If the other examples are in the thousands of hectares or the couple of thousands hectares, these are in the tens of thousands, if not 20 and 30 and 50,000 hectares in terms of the scale of what is being proposed. Perhaps the most notable one of this is a project called the Capital Cairo. Egypt itself, and Cairo in particular, has a long legacy of new town projects that have been proposed. The Capital Cairo is just the newest version of those, intending to shift much of the population of Cairo itself to the east into a new area of settlement that is roughly the size of Singapore in terms of what is ultimately being proposed. And so you see, as you drive down the highways or drive out of the city, this idea of real estate, this idea of settlement as being the kind of driver of economy. I think it's important here to point out once again that we think of urbanization as a positive act. We think of urbanization as something that is doing good. These are examples where urbanization is being instrumentalized for financial gain and for political gain at the expense of sort of society, at the expense of the environment, at the expense of political stability. And therefore, design and planning's participation in these actions without a kind of critical eye suggests that we are in some ways complicit with the production of these kind of landscapes. If we're not aware of them or we're not taking account of them, we're essentially supporting these kind of undertakings. And so you see here images, again, that look quite similar to what we saw in Morocco, look quite similar to what we saw in Spain, not just because of the landscape, but because of the kind of incompletion and the state of denution on the ground. And so we look at this and one might say, well, there's all these examples of failure. There's all these examples of competing projects. Why are these initiatives continued to be pursued? And the reason from my perspective is quite simple. There's a desire to project political power. There's a desire to attract foreign investment. There's a desire to create low-skill, high-wage jobs for a population. These projects, if done properly and if executed, are able to create revenue for the municipality that's undertaking them, either through land sales or taxes. In the cases where they're not being built, but a plan has been proposed and approved, they change the value of a piece of land. Simply by drawing a plan, you have, in a proposal for a piece of territory, you've changed the value of that territory because you've projected what is possible there. And so you can extract the value from that. And really what these projects are ultimately motivated by is the desire to project an instantaneous image of modernity and accomplishment. There's no interest in the process. There's no interest in the transformation. It's about the image of completion that, you know, whether it's the King of Morocco or, you know, two people to the left there, the president of France, seeing this thing as a state of accomplishment in many ways is what drives these sort of speculative projects. There's a lot of literature, or the common accusation is that many of these projects are being promoted by China. They're trying to emulate the Chinese urban growth model. And while there is a sense of trying to emulate the model, much of what is being promoted is not being promoted by the Chinese at all, but is actually being promoted by, as I mentioned before, the entities from the former colonial states or the Middle East. And all of these projects, though, really are subscribing to this idea of the global city and the idea that the global city can be measured and can be bullet pointed, and that if you have these things available, then you're able to compete at the global economic scale. And so city rankings from places like The Economist or A.T. Kearney or The Atlantic, places that start to kind of compare different urban settlements as a kind of apples to apples way, start to write a recipe for what is expected in these new pieces of settlement, whether that recipe is appropriate to the place that's being deployed or not. As a result, there's a lot of risk associated with these undertakings, as I've shown you in Spain in particular, but also in some of the historical examples. The Danish economist Bent Flyvberg has written about mega projects, not as settlement, but in infrastructure and healthcare and IT, and the kind of inherent risks in those projects, that those kind of endeavors at this scale always cost more, always are promoted as being more successful than they actually end up being, always have lower usage, and always have greater environmental impacts. So he's not talking about, Flyvberg is not talking about urbanization, he's talking about other kinds of mega projects, but I think we can apply this logic to the mega projects of settlement that we're looking at to know that no matter what, these endeavors always cost more than they're estimated and always serve far fewer than projected. No matter how good the planning is, no matter how good the data is, this is an inevitability to operating at this scale. So what that means for us as designers or future designers and planners is that given these prior speculative events, we should understand that it's absurd to try to design and plan settlement by focusing solely on an outcome at its end product. That there's no guarantee of reaching that point, and even if there was, we can't control how we get there. So the question for us then is, so what? What does that mean? We know that as designers and planners, we're probably not going to change the flow of global capital, particularly as it relates to real estate development. But on the other hand, it would be irrational for us, and I would say unethical for us, to not take the risk and volatility that's implicit in these endeavors into account in the work that we do. So what that means is that for us, when we start to undertake urban design projects, urban planning projects, we need to shift our focus. Our focus needs to shift from a preferred outcome, a focus on the end product or the end state, to something more akin to a kind of contingent mode of operation. That is, that we prioritize the beginning and we think about how the project might adapt, correct, or revise as in response to certain inputs. So here, the image cannot be the final state. The image needs to be the process itself as we start to think about these new pieces of settlement. What this is an approach to urban design and planning that does not rely on a state of completion to achieve measurable success. And I think in all of the examples that I've shown you over the last 50 minutes or so, the reason that they all look like they're failures is because they haven't reached that final state. But if we think about the incremental process of implementation and trying to allow those to stand on their own, it fundamentally changes what we would deploy and fundamentally changes how we would start to conceive of these new pieces of settlement. These are a series of drawings that we have done related to some of the examples that I've shown you today that start to look specifically at the landscape that is being transformed, both in terms of the kind of quality of that landscape as well as the character of it, the biodiversity and the kind of values that are embedded within those landscapes. And I think what is most notable and sort of the point that we try to make here is that the settlement that is being proposed across the African continent and really throughout the world rarely takes into account the place that it's being deployed. For the most part, it simply superimposes itself onto that landscape and remakes it in the image of this ideal version of urban form. So whether it's in a desert or a savanna or a grassland or a rainforest, settlement is always treated the same at present as opposed to being rethought and recalibrated to the reality of the place. This to me is the opportunity here and sort of where I start to get to the conclusion of what is now a very long-winded presentation. But I think there is an opportunity, if we are to take it, to start to think about urbanization that is led by the sort of response and treatment of the landscape. And so if we're looking at the kind of the organization of irrigation, the organization of transport, the organization of water and sanitation, of land use, these are all land-related aspects that really underpin and guide and organize how settlement gets deployed. And these are, I would argue, the domain of the landscape architect, the domain of the urban designer, and these are the places that we can begin to focus our work and our attention. So I've used this subject matter as the focus of a number of studios recently that really start to look at urban form not as a kind of fixed outcome or a sort of preferred end, but actually as a kind of operating system, a system that has inputs and outputs that can be recalibrated in time depending on variables like growth in population, changes in economy, changes in climate, that starts to look at urban settlement as being much more adaptive. And that urban settlement can start to adapt not only to the kind of designed operating system, but also by looking at the vernacular patterns of settlement and of organization and starting to scale those up to become more in line with the ambitions of the settlement that's being proposed. These are examples or proposals of student work that start to think about proposals for settlement in the terms of contingency as opposed to terms of outcome. So if then sort of scenarios or in response to we do this kind of propositions. They also look at examples of what is desired by the promoters of these projects, the image of completion, the image of modernity, the image of economic success, and whether or not we can actually accomplish some of those desires without relying on the conventional terms of urban design and urban development. Perhaps the most kind of compelling example of this is this idea of the minimum viable product. How much do you need? What do you need to allow a piece of settlement to stand on its own? How many people need to be there? What are the parts that it's comprised of? If you deploy that minimum viable product and allow it to grow, when do you deploy the next version of that? So this kind of incremental idea of urbanization as opposed to a fixed outcome is really the sort of motivation behind these propositions, as well as thinking about the way settlement can begin to bundle and connect to other infrastructures that aren't mobility related. So whether that's related to water, whether that's related to energy production, how settlement is organized not by cars and by trains, but by other kinds of infrastructures. And so what all of that is, and really what I'm arguing for here, is this idea of embracing the volatility and the risk in these examples as a way of retooling the way that we think about urban design and planning. That we're really simply replicating all of the mistakes of the 20th century in these proposals for new settlement. I didn't name any of the designers of the projects that we've shown you, but they're not necessarily the local hack that you might think they are. They are global practices, well-known practices of 2 or 3 letter acronyms that you would recognize. And what they are doing is simply promoting an example of settlement that we have proven is no longer valid. And is not appropriate to the place that's being deployed, no matter how green the renderings look or how much greenwash the plan actually gets. My argument here is that this volatility and risk suggests a totally different way of approaching the design and planning of new settlement, and its approach that is much more about its initiation than it is about its outcome. My hope is that during your time at Penn, you'll have the opportunity to think about this process, to think about the way that landscape can be used to guide settlement, not just in terms of the kind of public spaces and the places of social collection, but really in the terms of the systems and the kind of the larger services that these settlements are deployed into. So rather than, as you see in this image here, clearing the land of the savannah outside of Nairobi, we might start to think about how settlement can start to insert itself and integrate itself into what are really fantastic and really spectacular landscapes, no matter where they are or where they exist. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in around Meyerson Hall sometime in the very near future.